The first thing I noticed wasn't the people. It was the sign. My truck had barely rolled to a stop at the end of my ranch road when I saw it standing beside the fence line like it had always belonged there. Meadow Ridge Community Trail. The wooden sign was freshly painted, mounted on two thick cedar posts, planted directly in the ground inside my property line. For a moment I thought I was looking at the wrong land. But then I saw the old oak tree. The same one my father used to tie our horses to. And beneath it, a wide gravel walking trail cut straight through my pasture. Not a dirt path. Not a small track. A fully built trail, nearly 8 feet wide, with wooden benches, trail markers, and even a small bridge crossing the creek that ran through my ranch. And people were using it. Joggers. Dog walkers. Families pushing strollers. All casually walking across land that had belonged to my family for 40 years. One man even waved at me as he passed. Beautiful trail, right? The HOA finally finished it while you were gone. While I was gone. I had spent the last 11 months deployed overseas. And while I was serving, someone had built an entire community walking trail through my ranch. Then I noticed the second thing. A white envelope tucked under the trail sign, stamped with the HOA logo. Inside was a formal notice. Community Trail Construction Assessment, $38,460 due within 30 days. At the bottom was a handwritten note from the HOA president. You're welcome. The land looks much better now. I folded the letter slowly and looked down the trail cutting across my ranch. One question sat quietly in my mind. How did the HOA convince an entire neighborhood they owned land that had never belonged to them? Before we go further, if you enjoy realistic justice stories where patience beats power, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. Because sometimes the biggest mistake powerful people make is assuming the quiet person they're pushing around doesn't understand the system. The ranch had never been meant to impress anyone. It was simply land that had been in my family longer than most of the houses in the area had even existed. 18 acres of pasture, a narrow creek running through the middle, and an old ranch house my father built with his own hands before the neighborhood around it ever appeared. When people drove past it, they usually just saw open space. To me, it was history. My father used to say land like this only had one real job: stay in the family. 5 years earlier, that quiet land suddenly had new neighbors. A developer bought the fields bordering my property and turned them into a large suburban community called Meadow Ridge. Rows of new houses went up. Streetlights. Sidewalks. And eventually something else that came with every modern neighborhood. An HOA. At first the board didn't bother me much. Most of their rules stayed inside their own neighborhood. But after a year or two, the question started. People walking their dogs would stop near my fence and ask about the creek. A few neighbors mentioned how nice it would be if there was a walking trail connecting the community to the open land behind my ranch. I always answered politely. But the answer was always the same. This is private property. Most people accepted that. One person didn't. The HOA president. Diane Whitaker. Diane had a background in real estate development, and she treated the HOA like a small business she was running. Every board meeting seemed to introduce a new improvement project. Landscaping expansions. Playgrounds. Community features designed to increase property values. One evening she approached me directly about an idea she called the Meadow Ridge Wellness Trail. A walking path that would run through the neighborhood and loop around the nearby creek. The problem was obvious. The shortest route for that trail ran straight across my ranch. I listened to her pitch. Then I declined. Calmly. A few days later I followed up with a short written message confirming that the ranch would not be used for any community project. That should have been the end of the conversation. Not long after that, I received my deployment orders overseas. Before leaving, I locked the ranch gate and arranged for a caretaker to check on the property once a month. The land sat quiet when I left. Just grass, creek water, and open pasture. But while I was gone, The HOA board apparently decided something important, because by the time I came home, the ranch wasn't empty anymore. When I first saw the trail sign, I thought it might be temporary. Maybe someone had placed it there by mistake. But the moment I drove farther down the ranch road, that idea disappeared. The gravel path wasn't small. It cut straight through the center of my pasture like it had been planned by engineers. The edges were lined with compacted stone. Wooden posts marked distances along the trail. Someone had even installed benches. One of them sat right beside the creek my father used to fish in. And people were everywhere. Joggers moving past like they'd been running that path for months. 2 women walking dogs stopped to let me pass. One of them smiled politely. "Trail's great, isn't it?" The HOA finally finished it a few weeks ago. I didn't answer. Instead, I kept driving slowly along the edge of the path, trying to understand what I was seeing. Because this wasn't a shortcut someone had carved through the grass. This was a full construction project. Gravel trucks. Survey crews. Labor. Whoever built it had invested serious money. When I reached the old ranch gate, my caretaker was already there waiting. He looked uneasy. "They said it was approved," he told me quietly. "Approved how?" "The HOA said they had access rights. Something about a resolution the board passed." I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the main trail entrance again. That's when I noticed the envelope. White. Official. Tucked under the edge of the wooden trail sign. The return address was printed clearly at the top. Meadow Ridge HOA. Inside was a formal notice. A typed letter explaining that the new community walking trail crossed my property and that I was responsible for my portion of construction and maintenance costs. At the bottom was a number. $38,460. Due within 30 days. Below the amount was a second paragraph. Failure to pay would result in additional penalties and possible lien proceedings. Then there was a handwritten note at the bottom. Diane Whitaker's signature was easy to recognize. The message was short. "The community appreciates your cooperation." I folded the paper slowly and slipped it back into the envelope. Across the pasture, more walkers were stepping onto the trail like it had always been there. I didn't shout. I didn't call the HOA. Instead, I took out my phone and started taking pictures. Because one thing was already clear. Someone had convinced an entire neighborhood that this trail belonged there. And I needed to know exactly who told them that. I didn't call the HOA that day. Instead, I went home and started doing what I had been trained to do for most of my career. Document everything. The first folder on my laptop was simple. Trail construction. Inside it went every photo I had taken. The benches. The bridge over the creek. The gravel path cutting across the pasture. Then I created a second folder. HOA correspondence. The assessment letter went there first. The number printed on the page kept pulling my attention back. $38,460. For a trail I had never approved. For construction that had happened while I was thousands of miles away. The next morning I drove into the county office. If a project that large had been built on private land, it should have left paperwork somewhere. Permits. Inspection reports. Zoning approvals. The clerk searched the database while I waited. Then she frowned slightly. "There's nothing here for a trail project on that parcel." I gave her the property number again. She searched one more time. Still nothing. No construction permit. No land use change. No recorded easement. Which meant one of two things. Either the HOA had skipped the county process completely, or they were relying on something else. When I returned home, a second letter was waiting in my mailbox. Same HOA letterhead. Same formal tone. But this time the number had changed. The balance now showed $41,720. Additional fees had been added. Administrative charges. Insurance costs. A line labeled Community Maintenance Participation. At the bottom was a warning. Failure to pay within 15 days would trigger late penalties and legal recovery procedures. A few hours later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a local number I didn't recognize. When I answered, Diane Whitaker's voice came through immediately. "I assume you received the updated assessment." I did. "You should understand something," she continued calmly. "The trail is extremely popular with the community. It's improved property values throughout the neighborhood." Her tone stayed polite, but the message underneath it wasn't subtle. "This project isn't going away." I didn't argue. I simply asked one question. What document authorized construction on my land? There was a short pause. Then she answered, "The board approved a community access resolution months ago." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "You'll receive the paperwork through the HOA office." The call ended a few seconds later. 2 days after that, the paperwork arrived. Inside the envelope was a single document titled Community Recreation Access Resolution. The board had voted to approve construction of the Meadow Ridge Trail System. The document referenced something called a recreational corridor easement connected to my property. But when I checked the county property records again, my ranch was still listed exactly the same as it had always been. Private agricultural land. No corridor. No access agreement. No easement. Yet the HOA was already acting like the question had been settled. A third notice arrived the following week. The balance had increased again. $48,600. The letter included a new line. Failure to resolve the outstanding assessment may result in a lien being placed on the property. Meanwhile, the trail stayed busy. Every morning, joggers passed through my pasture. Families pushed strollers across the bridge the HOA had built over my creek. And online neighborhood forums had started posting pictures celebrating the new trail. One post caught my attention. Someone had written, "Finally, someone put that empty ranch land to good use." I closed the laptop and leaned back in the chair. Because if the HOA truly believed they had the authority to build that trail, there had to be a document somewhere they were relying on. And when I looked at the resolution again, one line kept standing out. The board claimed construction was supported by an existing easement. The problem was, I had never granted one. 2 weeks after the second letter arrived, the HOA scheduled a public board meeting. The agenda was posted on the neighborhood website. One item stood out immediately. Trail Maintenance Assessment Discussion. My name was listed underneath it. By the time I arrived, the small community hall was already full. Residents filled the rows of folding chairs. Some of them were people I had seen walking across my ranch earlier that week. At the front of the room, a projector screen displayed a large photo of the trail. Diane Whitaker stood beside it, dressed the same way she always did for board meetings, sharp blazer, perfectly organized notes in front of her. When the meeting began, she spoke confidently. The Meadow Ridge Community Trail has quickly become one of the most valued features of our neighborhood. She clicked to the next slide. Photos appeared showing families walking the path, joggers crossing the wooden bridge, a group of children riding bicycles along the gravel trail that cut across my pasture. Usage numbers are extremely high, she continued. The project has already increased property value estimates across several sections of the community. Then she paused. And unfortunately, the property owner whose land borders the trail has refused to cooperate with the maintenance assessment. A few heads in the audience turned toward me. Diane continued speaking. "We're simply asking him to pay his fair portion of the cost." She displayed another slide. The total construction budget appeared on the screen. $123,000. Then a second number appeared below it. Property owner share, $48,600. Several residents nodded. From the way Diane explained it, the situation sounded simple. The community had built something good. and I was trying to stop it. One of the board members leaned toward the microphone. If the assessment remains unpaid, he said, the HOA will proceed with legal recovery and lien placement. The word lien echoed through the room. Diane folded her hands and looked directly at me. Her voice stayed calm, but there was a hint of something sharper behind it. You've served overseas, and we appreciate that, she said. But service doesn't give someone the right to block progress at home. A few people in the audience murmured agreement. I didn't respond. I simply wrote the sentence down in my notebook. When the meeting ended, the board filed the paperwork they had been threatening. Within 3 days, the county records office posted an official notice. The HOA had placed a lien against my ranch. The balance had climbed again. With legal processing fees included, the total demand now stood at $72,400. According to the notice, the HOA would begin foreclosure review proceedings if the balance remained unpaid. The deadline was 45 days. The neighborhood website celebrated the meeting as a victory. Posts praised Diane for protecting the community trail. Photos of the path continued appearing online every weekend. From the outside, the situation looked finished. The HOA had the paperwork. The trail stayed open. And the lien suggested the ranch might eventually become community property anyway. For the first time since I returned home, it looked like the board had already won. But that night, sitting at my desk again, I opened the document they kept referencing. The Community Recreation Access Resolution. And one small detail kept bothering me. The resolution didn't actually grant the HOA access to my land. It only referenced something else. A document number. An existing easement. Which meant the board wasn't claiming they created the access. They were claiming it had already existed. The question was simple. Where did that easement come from? Because if it was real, the HOA might actually have a case. But if it wasn't, then the entire trail running through my ranch had been built on a mistake that was about to become very expensive. That night the ranch was quiet again. The kind of quiet that only happens when the neighborhood lights shut off and the traffic fades away. But the trail wasn't quiet. Even in the dark I could see the faint outline of the gravel path cutting across my pasture. Every few minutes someone passed through with a flashlight or a phone screen glowing in their hand. Like the land had never belonged to anyone. I sat at the kitchen table with the lien notice in front of me. $72,400. 45 days before foreclosure review. On paper, the HOA looked confident. They had the board vote. They had the resolution. And they had convinced an entire neighborhood that the trail was legitimate. Most people in that situation would probably explode. Call lawyers. Start shouting at board meetings. But years in the military had taught me something different. Systems beat emotions. Problems get solved by understanding how the system failed, not by yelling about it. I opened the HOA resolution again and read the line they kept referencing. Community Recreation Corridor Access supported by existing easement record. That phrase had appeared in every document the HOA sent. They were relying on something that already existed. An easement. But easements don't appear out of nowhere. They're recorded. Filed. Indexed in county land records. And earlier that week, the county clerk had told me something important. There were no active easements on my property. Which meant one of two things. Either the HOA had discovered a document I hadn't seen yet, or they were relying on a document that no longer meant what they thought it meant. I leaned back in the chair and looked out the window toward the pasture. The bridge they built over the creek was visible in the moonlight. People were still walking across it. Confident. Comfortable. Like the fight had already been decided. But the more I thought about the resolution, the more one question kept repeating in my mind. If the HOA really had a valid easement, why hadn't the county been able to find it? The official lien notice arrived by certified mail 3 days later. A thick envelope with the county seal stamped across the front. Inside was the document that made everything feel suddenly very real. Notice of property lien, Meadow Ridge HOA. The balance had increased again. Legal filing fees. Processing charges. Administrative penalties. The total now read $74,218. According to the notice, the HOA had the right to pursue foreclosure proceedings if the balance remained unpaid. 45 days. That was the timeline. If nothing changed before the hearing date, the board could begin the legal process to recover the money they claimed I owed, which meant the ranch itself could eventually become collateral. The HOA wasted no time celebrating. A message appeared on the neighborhood website the next morning. The Meadow Ridge Board has successfully secured the community trail project. Maintenance responsibilities are now being enforced. Several residents congratulated Diane Whitaker in the comments. Photos of the trail appeared again that weekend. Families smiling. Dogs running across the bridge over my creek. People thanking the board for protecting such a great community feature. To anyone watching from the outside, the situation looked finished. The HOA had the paperwork. The lien was recorded. And the foreclosure deadline was approaching fast. Even the county clerk I had spoken to earlier seemed resigned when I visited the office again. HOA liens are hard to fight, she said carefully. Most people end up settling. Back at the ranch, the trail stayed busy. Joggers moved across the gravel path like nothing had changed. Children rode bicycles along the stretch that crossed the pasture. The HOA had turned the land into something public. And now they were acting like the law supported them. For the first time since I returned from deployment, it looked like the board had already won. But that evening, sitting at the same kitchen table again, I made one more request through the county record system. Not for permits. Not for zoning documents. For something much older. I searched the archives for any easement that had ever been attached to my property. And when the records office finally responded, they sent back a document number I had never seen before. The county records office emailed the document the next morning. At first glance, it didn't look important. Just another scanned record from the archive system. The file date caught my attention immediately. 22 years earlier. Long before the Meadow Ridge neighborhood even existed. I opened the document and started reading. It was an easement agreement. But not the kind the HOA had been describing. The title at the top said, Temporary Survey Access Easement, County Infrastructure Planning. The document explained that county survey crews had been granted limited access across the property for a short period of time while mapping potential utility routes. It allowed them to cross a narrow section of the land for equipment and measurements. Nothing more. Then I noticed the expiration clause. The easement had been valid for 18 months only. After that period, the document clearly stated that all access rights would automatically terminate. I checked the timeline. The easement had expired more than 20 years ago. I compared the document number to the one referenced in the HOA resolution. They were identical. The HOA board had used the old survey easement as proof that the land already had a public corridor. But the easement wasn't public access. And it definitely wasn't permanent. It had been a temporary permission for surveyors. Nothing else. I opened the trail map the HOA had distributed to residents. The walking trail followed the exact same path that had been marked in that survey easement. Same corridor. Same coordinates. Which meant the HOA hadn't discovered a hidden access right. They had built their entire community trail based on a document that had stopped being valid decades earlier. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Because if the HOA really believed that easement still applied, then they hadn't just made a small mistake. They had built an entire public trail on land they had no legal right to touch. And suddenly the lien they had filed against my ranch didn't look nearly as powerful as they thought. I didn't contact the HOA right away. Instead, I started building a timeline. The same way we do in logistics planning. Events. Documents. Dates. Everything had to line up. First, I printed the easement the county had sent. Temporary survey access easement, expired. Then I placed it beside the HOA resolution they had mailed me weeks earlier. Both documents referenced the same corridor. The same strip of land that now held a gravel walking trail, wooden bridges, benches, and lighting posts. The only difference was time. The county easement had ended more than 2 decades ago. The HOA had treated it like it still existed, which meant their entire project depended on a misunderstanding. Or worse, a document they had never actually read. But before confronting anyone, I wanted confirmation from someone who dealt with land law every day. So I called the base legal office. Military legal assistance isn't meant to handle civilian lawsuits, but they often help service members understand property issues that arise during deployments. I sent them 2 files. The old easement and the HOA resolution. The reply came the following afternoon. The attorney asked one question first. Did you ever grant the HOA permission to build on the land? No. Did the county approve any permanent corridor easement? No. There was a short pause on the line. Then the attorney said something that changed everything. Then the HOA doesn't have access rights. He explained it in simple terms. Temporary easements are exactly what the name suggests. Temporary. Once they expire, the access rights disappear completely. They don't convert into permanent public corridors. They don't transfer to private organizations. And they definitely don't authorize construction. Which meant the gravel trail running through my ranch had been built without legal access. The wooden bridge over the creek had been installed without permission. Even the benches placed along the path counted as unauthorized structures. The HOA hadn't just misunderstood a document. They had constructed a community project on private land without a valid easement. And then they had charged the property owner for it. The attorney asked me to send one more document. The lien notice. When he read it, his response was immediate. They filed a lien against you for construction they weren't allowed to perform. That changed the entire situation. Because liens require legitimate debts. If the underlying charge was invalid, the lien itself could collapse. But the bigger issue wasn't the money. It was the land use violation. Construction projects that cross property lines normally require multiple approvals. Zoning review. Construction permits. Recorded easements. None of those appeared in the county system, which meant the project had bypassed every safeguard that normally protects landowners. The attorney suggested the next step. File a formal notice with the county land use office. Attach the expired easement. Attach the HOA resolution. And attach photographs of the trail construction. Let the county review it. So I prepared the packet. The documents were simple. Page 1 showed the old easement. Expiration date clearly printed. Page 2 showed the HOA resolution referencing that same easement number. Page 3 showed photographs of the gravel trail running across the ranch. Page 4 included the lien notice. I submitted everything to the county zoning office and requested a review. 3 days later, the inspector called. His tone was noticeably different from the clerk I had spoken to earlier. Are you the property owner of the ranch parcel west of Meadow Ridge? Yes. We've reviewed the documents you submitted. There was a pause. Then he asked another question. Did the HOA obtain your permission before constructing the trail? No. Another pause. Did you grant any form of permanent easement to the HOA? No. The inspector sighed quietly. Then we have a problem. He explained that the trail project appeared to have been built without valid land authorization, which meant it qualified as a property encroachment issue. Encroachment cases can get complicated quickly, because once structures are built across property lines, the responsible party may be required to remove them. And according to the construction photos, the HOA hadn't built something small. They had built an entire walking trail system. The inspector asked for one more thing. Do you have an estimate of the project's total construction cost? I opened the HOA presentation slide I had saved from the board meeting. According to their own documents, I said, it was around $123,000. The line stayed silent for a few seconds. Then the inspector said something I hadn't expected. We're scheduling a land use hearing. Because if the easement the HOA relied on had truly expired decades ago, then the trail running through my ranch wasn't a community feature. It was unauthorized construction. And the lien they had filed against my property was about to become a very serious legal mistake. By the end of that phone call, one thing had become clear. The HOA believed they had built something permanent. But the document they relied on had expired long before the first house in their neighborhood was even built. Which meant the next time Diane Whitaker stood in front of the community explaining the trail, she wasn't going to be presenting a victory anymore. She was going to be explaining how the entire project had been built on land that never belonged to the HOA in the first place. The county scheduled the hearing 2 weeks later. Word spread through the neighborhood quickly. By the time I arrived at the municipal building that morning, several Meadow Ridge residents were already gathered in the hallway. Some of them recognized me from the board meeting. Others had probably only seen my name online in HOA posts. Inside the hearing room, a long table had been set up for the county land use officer, a zoning inspector, and a clerk recording the session. Across the room sat Diane Whitaker and 2 other members of the HOA board. Their attorney had joined them as well. Stacks of documents sat neatly arranged in front of Diane. From the way she looked around the room, she still seemed confident. The inspector who had called me earlier stepped forward and began the hearing. This session concerns a property encroachment complaint regarding construction of the Meadow Ridge Community Trail. He displayed a large aerial map on the screen behind him. The gravel path cut clearly across my ranch property. The zoning officer spoke again. Before we begin reviewing documents, I'd like to confirm one point. He turned toward the HOA table. Does the Meadow Ridge HOA currently claim legal access rights to the corridor shown on this map? Diane leaned toward the microphone. Yes, she said calmly. The corridor has been recognized through an existing easement referenced in the HOA resolution. The zoning officer nodded slightly. Very well. Please provide the easement documentation supporting that claim. The HOA attorney slid a folder across the table. The clerk scanned the pages and projected them onto the screen. I recognized the document immediately. It was the same one I had already seen. The old survey easement. The zoning officer studied the page for several seconds. Then he asked a quiet question. Is this the document the HOA relied on to authorize construction of the trail? The attorney answered. Yes. The officer tapped a section near the bottom of the page. Are you aware that this easement expired 22 years ago? The room went silent. The HOA attorney leaned forward quickly and rechecked the document. Diane's expression changed slightly. That easement established a corridor across the property, she said carefully. The zoning officer shook his head. No. He turned to the next page of the document and highlighted a single paragraph. This was a temporary survey access easement granted to county survey crews during infrastructure planning. The expiration clause appeared clearly on the screen. Access rights terminated 18 months after the survey period. The officer looked back toward the HOA table. After that expiration date, no entity retained access rights to this land. A few residents in the audience began whispering. The zoning officer continued. Did the HOA obtain a new easement from the property owner before construction began? The attorney answered quietly. No. Did the HOA receive county approval for a permanent corridor easement? No. The officer paused for a moment. Then he clicked to the next image. Photographs of the trail appeared on the screen. The gravel path. The wooden bridge over the creek. The benches along the trail. According to these records, the officer said, the HOA constructed approximately 8/10 of a mile of trail across private agricultural land. He turned toward me. Is that property yours? Yes. Did you authorize the construction of the trail? No. The officer nodded and looked back toward the HOA board. Without a valid easement or landowner permission, this construction qualifies as unauthorized property encroachment. The word hung in the room like a weight. Several residents in the back exchanged surprised looks. Diane leaned toward the microphone again. The trail has been in use by the community for months, she said. It's improved the neighborhood significantly. The zoning officer's voice remained calm. Community benefit does not override property law. The clerk displayed another document on the screen. The lien notice the HOA had filed against my ranch. The officer raised an eyebrow slightly. The HOA also attempted to charge the property owner $74,000 for the construction of this trail. He paused. Construction that occurred without legal authorization. For the first time that morning, Diane didn't respond immediately. The HOA attorney leaned forward and whispered something to her. Then the zoning officer turned toward me. Is there anything you'd like to add? I stood slowly. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the air conditioner running behind the wall. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point at anyone. I simply looked toward the board table and spoke one sentence. You built a public trail on private land using a document that expired before your HOA even existed. For a moment, no one said anything. The words settled over the room. Residents began murmuring quietly among themselves. The zoning officer looked down at the documents again. Then he closed the folder in front of him. The confidence the HOA had shown for months was gone. Because the trail they had celebrated as a community victory was now officially being reviewed as a property violation. And the decision the county was about to announce would determine what happened to every foot of gravel running across my ranch. The hearing room stayed quiet for several seconds after I finished speaking. The zoning officer looked down at the documents again, slowly reviewing the pages in front of him. Then he spoke. Based on the evidence presented today, the Meadow Ridge HOA constructed a recreational trail across privately owned land without a valid easement or landowner authorization. He turned slightly toward the clerk. Please record that the county recognizes this construction as an unauthorized encroachment. The words changed the entire atmosphere in the room. Residents who had been confident earlier were now whispering to each other. Some of them looked genuinely surprised. The zoning officer continued. Because the project was built without a valid land use authorization, the HOA does not have the legal right to operate or maintain the trail on this property. He paused before adding the next line. And the lien filed against the property owner cannot be enforced. The clerk displayed the lien document on the screen again. The officer tapped it once with a pen. This lien is based on a financial obligation that does not legally exist. He looked toward the HOA attorney. The county will record a notice invalidating the lien immediately. Across the room, Diane Whitaker's posture stiffened. The officer continued. The HOA is also responsible for resolving the encroachment. That left only two possible outcomes. The board could negotiate with the landowner to purchase a legitimate easement, or the structures would have to be removed. The officer explained it clearly. Any trail structure is currently located on the property, including gravel paths, bridges, benches, and signage, must either be removed or authorized through a lawful easement agreement with the property owner. The numbers suddenly looked very different. According to the HOA's own project presentation, the trail had cost more than $123,000 to build. Removing it would cost even more. The zoning officer wasn't finished. He turned to the financial documents again. The HOA also attempted to charge the property owner $74,218 in construction and maintenance costs. He shook his head slightly. That assessment has no legal basis. The officer wrote several notes before speaking again. The HOA will be responsible for reimbursing the property owner for documented legal and administrative expenses related to this dispute. That meant every filing fee, every records request, every hour spent correcting the lien. The clerk recorded the ruling carefully. Then the officer addressed the final issue. Because the project proceeded without required approvals, the county will open an administrative review of the HOA board's actions. That review could lead to additional penalties, or even board removal under the HOA's governing bylaws. Several residents sitting behind the board table began whispering more loudly now. A few of them looked directly at Diane, the same president who had stood in front of the neighborhood weeks earlier celebrating the trail. Now the project she had promoted was officially classified as an unauthorized construction. The officer closed the file. This matter will remain open until the encroachment is resolved, which meant the gravel trail cutting through my ranch couldn't stay the way it was. Without a legal agreement, the HOA had only one realistic option: remove the trail. When the hearing ended, the residents slowly filed out of the room. Many of them avoided looking at the HOA board. Others stared at the documents displayed on the screen one last time. The trail they had celebrated as a community success had suddenly become a very expensive mistake. Outside the building, Diane Whitaker stood with the HOA attorney in the parking lot. They were speaking quietly, calculating what the ruling meant. The trail, the bridge, the benches, all of it now sat on land the HOA had never had the right to use. And the lien they had filed against my ranch, the one they thought would force me to pay for their project, was already being erased from the county records. For months, the HOA board had acted like the situation was simple. They believed paperwork gave them authority. But the one document they trusted the most turned out to be the one that ended the entire project. Because once the county confirmed that the easement had expired decades earlier, every piece of gravel running through my ranch became something very different. Not a community trail. A legal problem the HOA now had to fix. The trail stayed closed for the rest of the week. The county placed temporary notices at both entrances. Access suspended, land use review. For the first time since I returned from deployment, the gravel path cutting through my pasture was quiet. No joggers. No strollers. No bicycles crossing the bridge over the creek. Just wind moving through the grass the way it used to. 2 weeks later, the HOA sent an official notice to residents. The board had voted to remove the trail structures rather than attempt to negotiate a permanent easement. The cost estimates circulated through the neighborhood quickly. Removing the gravel path, dismantling the wooden bridge, hauling away benches, lighting posts, and trail signs. By the time contractors finished calculating everything, the total correction cost had climbed close to $150,000, not including the legal expenses. The board members who had approved the project faced a special vote during the next HOA meeting. Several residents demanded leadership changes. The same trail that had been presented as a community victory had now become the board's biggest mistake. A month later, construction trucks returned to the ranch. But this time they weren't building anything. They were removing it. The gravel was scraped away. The bridge over the creek was dismantled piece by piece. Even the wooden trail markers disappeared. Within days, the pasture began to look the way it had before. Grass slowly reclaimed the path where hundreds of people had walked just weeks earlier. One evening I stood near the creek where the bridge used to cross. The land was quiet again. A neighbor from the development approached the fence line and stopped. He looked across the pasture for a moment before speaking. "Sorry about all that," he said. I nodded once. No speeches. No celebration. Just the land returning to the way it had always been. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with a loud victory. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the form of a simple correction, and a reminder that paperwork can build a project, but it can also take one apart.